Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. More than a year after the fall of Assad, Syria's new transitional government under Ahmed al-Sharaa, formerly known as Abu Mohammed al-Julani, has almost been lifted to some sort of global celebrity of sorts. The international legitimacy granted to him makes the millions of dollars of bounty previously on him seem like it may have happened in a parallel universe. Sanctions have been lifted, European leaders are visiting Damascus and also hosting him, and Sharaa has met with Trump at the White House too. The narrative being pushed is that Syria is finally free from decades of dictatorship, a narrative that many agree with. Yet, for many in Syria, beneath this international rehabilitation lies a reality of continued authoritarianism, economic policies that at the very least echo the previous regime. Some argue that they signal something even worse, possibly, and violent suppression of minorities and autonomous regions. So the question emerges, has Syria fully transformed, or truly transformed rather, or have we simply witnessed the successful rebranding of authoritarian rule? To discuss this today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Joseph Daher. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and hosting me.
So you're a Swiss-Syrian academic, specializing particularly in Middle Eastern political economy. Your recent research has been tracking the economic trajectory under Syria's transitional government, revealing some troubling patterns in their approach to privatization, workers' rights, and some social policies. You've also documented throughout the years human rights violations, of course, under Assad, and also recently, that have largely escaped international attention. Your analysis goes beyond the headlines to examine what kind of Syria is actually being built now, economically, politically, and socially. So you also spent the start of 2026 in various parts of Syria, Joseph. So I want to start by asking, what are some of your reflections from your recent trip and, from speaking to people and just being there as well?
Thank you, Elif, for hosting me again. So it was my third time in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. I wasn't able to go back during the revolutionary period since 2011. So every time it's an opportunity for me to be able to go back to Syria to visit friends, family, but moreover to continue political activism, to help progressive networks, Democrats, try to develop networks, and obviously, democratic, social justice, and equality objectives. I think the Syrian political scene should be seen in a very much contradictory way. If we start with the positive things, definitely we cannot deny that we're in a better situation than before the fall of the Assad regime, in the meaning that we have now a developing political scene, the ability to speak, the ability to do conferences, the ability to do demonstrations. Actually, only yesterday had a couple of demonstrations for socio-economic reason regarding the government decision to transfer without any prior knowledge teachers from Lataki and Tartus to a location far from where they live, or a demonstration in Aleppo for people standing in the streets, very much impoverished. They've been forbidden to have their stands, etc. And you have also, a demonstration regarding political issues. For example, at the beginning of the year, I participated in a demonstration against protesting the reconciliation agreement between the government of Damascus and businessman Mohammed Hamsho, who was very much, the right hand, economically speaking, of the Assad family, Maher Assad, etc. So on one hand, you have the development of political scene, of freedom of expression. You have a more freedom when it comes to the media, to the ability to protest, to organize. Definitely, this is something I think we should put forward, and that is positive. Nevertheless, it is very contradictory. Why? Because all of these things are also being repressed directly or indirectly sometimes. There are threats against activists, journalists wanting to work on certain issues. Obviously, we've all seen during the past year the massacres that were committed first against the Alawites, civilians, mostly in March, Afterwards, massacres committed in July against the Jewish population, and both this followed, rising human rights violation against both this kind of civilian population or communities. At the same time, we've seen, throughout 2025, clashes or attacks by the armed forces affiliated with Damascus against Kurdish populations, whether in Aleppo, we've seen the continuation of violation of human rights, for example, in Afrin, which has suffered Turkish occupation with its allies, the proxies, and where we inherited, forms of political and geographic fragmentation in Syria from the Assad regime, from the various, if you want, ruling powers within Syria. In many ways, this fragmentation has been deepened. Today, there's very much questions about regarding what is the Syrian national identity. Is there any place for religious minorities, for various political orientations? Today, we have, as a result of the massacres committed against the Jewish population in Sweden, we have large sectors of the population in Sweden that wants to separate from Syria, obviously with the opportunistic assistance of Israel that doesn't care about the Jews, but want to increase, division among the Syrians, achieve more, if you want, things within Syria, just as we've seen, attempts to so-called in propaganda to assist the Kurds, but it's not about helping the Kurds. It never had been about this. Similarly, when we come to the socio-economic situation, we'll go much deeper, but we have more than 90% of the population living under the poverty line. 17 million people need humanitarian assistance, and actually economic policies of the government is worsening the situation of the people by suppressing commodities on key products such as bread, electricity, oil. Actually, we had continuous demonstration for the past few days regarding the rise of electricity prices, for example, in Syria. So it's a contradictory space and a contradictory moment we're living in Syria, where political action is wider according to region, but also you do have insecurity, but it is definitely wider. And there is a possibility to now be involved in politics within Syria, which is important. But at the same time, we have the construction, or at least the willingness of the new ruling authorities led by Ahmed al-Sharaa and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to build a new authoritarian regime. But it is not complete yet. And in this space, there is the ability to act. So again, I think for the past year, it's a contradictory movement, a contradictory political space, but still that we need to invest and try to help the various democratic and progressive networks.
And Joseph, many who celebrated essentially takeover by Ahmed al-Sharaa, celebrated it because it, of course, demonstrated, or it meant that it was the fall of Assad. But also many people argued that it couldn't get worse than Assad. That this is what people were saying. It was so bad for decades under the, broadly speaking, Assad family, but particularly the last several decades. And, this, therefore, many obviously perhaps unknowingly, but many also knowingly, therefore justified support for al-Sharaa, despite actually, as you've also, spoken about the HTS, but like his, therefore, al-Qaeda background. How do you respond to anyone but Assad, given that some of the risks and, as you've said, contradictions that you've already spoken about? Because as you've said as well, we've seen already attacks on minorities, the continuation and in some ways the deepening of harmful economic policies. So what do you think, or how do you respond to the anyone but Assad kind of line?
Yes, I think again, I think there are two levels to your question. First of all, it's nearly a complete natural feeling to say, after 50 years of dictatorship, 14 years of war, hundreds of thousands of people dying because of the Assad regime repression, murderous war against the civilian population, massive destruction of Syria, of habitats, infrastructures. We are celebrating or at least commemorating the large massacre of the city of Hama of the 80s that repressed a whole city. Tens of thousands of people were martyred, murdered by the Assad regime. So you have half of the population in Syria after 14 years of war being displaced internally or externally. So I think it's quite natural to say it's difficult to assume that we will have worse at first hand, and that people felt, a feeling of relief. For my part, while understanding this sentiment of relief of after decades of oppression, destruction, people, spending more than 10 years in prison for some political opponents, sometimes 30 years. So for all the components of the same population, you had celebration in the first few days following the fall of the Assad regime, from wide sectors of society, from the Alawite population to the Kurds, meaning the majority, minority, so in a good thing. So this is the first answer to you. I think it's quite natural to see a feeling of relief. I think the second part is saying, be careful. And from the first day following the fall of the Assad regime, I personally said, I don't trust Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because of its political background. Indeed, it has broken with its international, if you want, jihadist background, in the meaning that it doesn't have a transnational political program. It wants to settle within a national framework. It has broken with Al-Qaeda, it has broken with ISIS, but this does not mean it has transformed into a democratic organization. And we shouldn't, create forms of illusion of what was its rule in Idlib. It was very repressive. And few months before, actually, the fall of the Assad regime, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham rule was facing strong protest within Idlib, with people, with raising slogans such as "the people want the fall of Julani." So, and for me, they are part of the counter-revolution. The way they developed was part of the repression of the Assad regime against all the Democrats, all the progressives, while you had the rise of Islamic fundamentalist forces that in all the principles, objective ran against the initial objectives of the revolution, that was democracy, social justice, and equality. So for me, since the beginning, it has been a kind of a race when one side, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leadership is trying to consolidate its power within Syria, and it sought first of all to do this through external legitimacy. And until today, it has not seeken internal legitimacy from the Syrian population, from its majority, minority, etc. At no point there were, form of a genuine, national conference. There was one, but it was a joke. It was, as we called it in Syria, a theater piece. No real elections. On the opposite, it was 5,000 people appointing people that are very often close, or at least do not differentiate in their political orientation with the new leadership of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And on the opposite, we see deepened division within society. So it was a race between, on one side, HTS consolidation of a new authoritarian rule, and what I call the civil society, but civil society in its, if you want, Gramscian understanding, meaning political parties, trade unions, social movements, to try to consolidate an independent power to face, the consolidation of power of HTS. And this is very hard until today to consolidate for various reasons. We can go back to it. So no, I think we shouldn't create illusions. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has first, seeking to deepen its consolidation of power through external legitimacy. Gulf monarchies, Turkey, the US, no internal legitimacy. At the same time, it has consolidated its domination over state institutions. The presidency has, large powers. There's still no parliament. Moreover, it has consolidated through networks of personalities close to Ahmed al-Sharaa. So we once again have the brother Ahmed al-Sharaa called Maher, like Maher Assad, but this one, Maher al-Sharaa, in charge of the secretary of the presidency. His other brother, Hazem al-Sharaa, taking care of the new economic networks that are being built, new crony capitalist dynamics. All the key ministries are in the hand of key personalities of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, historically speaking. We have new informal networks connected to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, trying to manage, state institutions, other interventions of, other kind of informal political institution affiliated with HTS to prevent some political activities or to intervene within civil society sector. This was the second way to consolidate its power. And the third one has been the instrumentalization of sectarianism as a way to divide, control, and mobilize population, as we've seen the massacres against the Alawites, against the Jews, and to some extent also a sectarian discourse used to mobilize sectors, or at least sectors of the population regarding the latest military offensives against the Kurds. We've seen on state-affiliated medias or in the press, affiliated with the new ruling class, a very much, ethnic, racist discourse against the Kurds, or to present, all of SDF as terrorists or PKK, etc., in problematic ways. So using this instrumentalization of sectarianism also to consolidate its power, because also it was failing on the socioeconomic side in many ways. Obviously, to resume my answer on one side, it is understandable to celebrate the end of a 50 years barbarous dictatorship and the ability to open a new kind of a new phase in the history of Syria. But secondly, I don't think we should give any illusions on what HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, is. And actually, its policies have showed us that no illusion should be created. On the opposite, they're seeking to consolidate a new authoritarian power with dynamics that are very much similar to the previous regime. Rather than rupture in authoritarian dynamics, we have continuity.
I mean, I want to speak a bit more about particularly Idlib, but also kind of the internal, legitimacy or lack thereof in a second. But you also spoke a lot about the external legitimacy that Sharaa in particular as an individual, but obviously the kind of the transitional government that he also represents received, internationally. And for many watching, it really, really was very, very rapid. Why do you think, from your perspective, and I'm sure there's many layers to it, but, why has the vast majority of, international powers, let's call it, been so eager to grant legitimacy to Sharaa personally, but also his government, when all the things that you've mentioned, all the issues, all the risks, or all the lived realities, even of the last year, of course, these states are very well aware of, even if we don't talk about the previous history of Sharaa. And there's also we don't know exactly to the extent, but there's also reports that even a year before Sharaa was able to take over from Assad, so topple Assad, he was in touch with certain sections of the British state, and certain British think tanks were essentially preparing him for this position. What are your thoughts and reflections on that?
Yeah, on the last part, I will come back to this later on. That unfortunately, some, I would say, researchers have become, whether local or internationally, kind of spokesperson to the new ruling authorities, and lacking, I think, in many ways, kind of integrity when it comes to their research, etc. But this is something else we can speak of later on, unfortunately. When it comes to the legitimization, the process of legitimization of the new ruling authorities dominated by Hayat Tahrir Sham, I think, as we shouldn't, create illusions on the democratic orientation of Hayat Tahrir Sham, we shouldn't also create illusions. And when we speak about, the international community, what we mean is mostly Western powers regarding Europe and the US. While, when it comes to regional countries, they don't hide the fact that what they want to create in Syria is authority and stability. Historically, in the past few years, before the toppling of the Assad regime, Turkey and Qatar had developed quite, good relations with HTS, or at least, entertaining relations with it for various reasons, whether to secure some regional international agreements, or to secure so-called secure the borders with Turkey. And therefore, definitely Qatar and Turkey were the biggest winners when it came to the fall of the Assad regime, despite the fact we shouldn't forget that Turkey was seeking normalization, the Assad regime, for which are the same reasons that today, that basically they wanted to push for the return of Syrian refugees from Turkey to Syria. And moreover, they wanted to see an end to any form of self-determination of the Kurdish people in Syria, because they perceive it as a direct national threat in continuation to the Kurdish national issue within Turkey. So they wanted an end to both of these things. And also they saw, as we're seeing today, Syria as an important market to win economically speaking. So Turkey and Qatar were the biggest winners of the toppling of the Assad regime. But very rapidly, Ahmed al-Sharaa understood that for a process of legitimization to be much wider, regionally, internationally, it needed to contact other countries. And he knew that the key to the opening to the rest of the Arab world was Saudi Arabia. This is why his first trip to a foreign country was Saudi Arabia. And one of his first statements was to say the revolution ended. Now we're in a phase of building the state, and Syria and its new ruling leadership is ready to guarantee the security of the Gulf monarchies. So meaning this was quite clear. We give security and guarantees to the Gulf monarchies in this perspective, and want to seek collaboration with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies. After this, even if you see the first statements of the UAE, which, since the beginning of the revolutionary processes in the Middle East and North Africa, were very much, opposed to anything relating to Islamic fundamentalism or Muslim Brotherhood, etc., while they made quite, statements that were not optimistic, after a few months, they were the key actor doing the kind of mediation as a first actor between Israel and the new ruling leadership in Syria. Saudi Arabia opened the key for the rest of the Arab world, but also for the US and the Western countries. Basically, you can trust them. And the first meeting between US President Trump and Ahmed al-Sharaa occurred in Saudi Arabia. Okay, yeah. And you had a process of lifting of sanctions from now. In the same time, in this process of legitimization, Syria opened the way for normalization with the Zionist state, with the apartheid state of Israel. So what does it tell us? Actually, regardless of the ideology or the authoritarian practices in places in Syria, the most important for regional and international countries, including Western states such as Europe or the US, is the question is if this ruling class serve our own interest. Well, it's clear, it's quite clear, yes, it is ready to serve, Western interest. First of all, by the normalization with Israel, trying to also reinforce the border control with Lebanon to prevent, the sending of weapons and cash to Hezbollah. Actually, Syria was the only country following the attack by Israel and the US against Iran not to condemn this action. And it's not solely connected to the fact of the destructive and murderous role played by Iran and Hezbollah within Syria during the Syrian revolution, but because of this kind of, as I was saying, political evolution. The new Syrian regime or the new Syrian, ruling class wants to root Syria in a Western-led coalition with, allying itself with the Gulf monarchies in Turkey. And this shouldn't be a surprise. We've seen, Western states support various dictatorships in the region, regardless of the ideology. If we look at the past history, where the Islamic fundamentalist countries, where the authoritarian states, but also to support a genocide and enabling a genocide against the Palestinians. Netanyahu is still very much welcome in most of the European countries. The genocide is only able to go on against the Palestinians because of US assistance and also Western support in general. So we shouldn't see as a surprise, the hypocrisy of Western states to be once again seen in Syria, regardless of violation of human rights. What I think is important for the European and US is the form of authoritarian stability. And when they see violation of human rights against minorities or Kurds or other sectors of the population, what is bothering them if it will create instability for their own interest. Moreover, this also the Ahmed al-Sharaa and has been very keen to work within the so-called international coalition against ISIS. And even prior to the toppling of the Assad regime, they've been collaboration to some extent between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and various Western security services in the fight against Al-Qaeda and Daesh, because they're seen as rivals politically speaking, even though they're part of it. Finally, a last element to take into consideration: why is HTS seeking this kind of Western-rooted alliance also with Gulf monarchies and Turkey? It is also, and here we see continuity rather than rupture, is to welcome foreign direct investment by these countries. So deepening neoliberal economic policies within Syria, attracting foreign investment from these countries, especially in non-productive sectors of the economy, such as real estate, tourism, big malls, finance, etc. And we have a kind of replica or a return from the 2000s. This was basically the policy of Bashar al-Assad when he came to power in the 2000s. And the biggest foreign investments at the end of the 2000s in Syria was from Turkey and Gulf monarchies. And most of the projects that were presented throughout 2025 to be open for foreign investments are projects that were already present in the 2000s. So here we understand why these Western states, despite their so-called principles regarding human rights, democracy, freedom, women's rights, etc., are just a form of rhetoric, because when it comes to serving Western national interests, this government is very much ready to do so, and running against, I think, the interest of the Syrian population. Regarding, for example, again, Israeli further expansion of occupation in southern Syria, we haven't seen many harsh statements from the Syrian ruling class or any form of popular resistance. I'm not saying launching a war. No one is expecting this in Syria because of the weakness. But no one also have been hearing about the fact that Turkey is still very much present in Syria, military speaking. When I was last September, October, we could still see, in northwest of Syria, Turkish military camps, Turkish flags. This runs against the sovereignty of the Syrian population. Similarly, in the latest military offensive against the autonomous administration northeast of Syria, Turkey participated logistically and even bombed some areas of Syria. This is running against, I think, Syrian interest in meaning for the population or the common good, and a lack of sovereignty.
I mean, I want to speak a bit more about that, I do also want to touch on to the role of Qatar, particularly in terms of the quote unquote soft power it's been using regionally as well in a second. But you know, just to follow on from what you've said, opponents of whether you call it Kurdish autonomy or autonomy of the formally recognizing the autonomy of the region of the northeast of Syria, have part of the way that they've justified that that opposition is to claim that the decentralization of Syria would balkanize Syria and therefore it would be a weak Syria. But you've also just explained and explored, quite a lot where actually the country is already, operating under multiple spheres of influence. The Turkish lira, until very recently, was the currency in Idlib under the HTS control, and also in other parts like in Afrin and so on under Turkish occupation. As you've also said, Israel has expanded into further into the southern territories of Syria, into the Golan Heights, as many would know, and also we're seeing the kind of, as you've said as well, the privatization and neoliberalization of the economy, which sure, perhaps it would be facilitated through the central government, but also the policies encouraging foreign investment to that degree. Also, there's an argument to make about like spheres of influence economically as well. how can we read this contradiction that, on the one hand, the very forces or the people that are arguing against a decentralized or a federal Syria so vehemently and claiming that that would be a weak Syria, either are the very forces that are part of, different spheres of influence or literal territory or have been part of literal territorial occupation of Syria, or have like other forms of influence. Do you think how can we read this contradiction? How can we understand, the assault on the Kurdish areas? Are they really about preventing fragmentation or the Balkanization or whatever it may be called, or it does attacking the autonomous regions also serve another strategic purpose, particularly for Shara, which for me it sounds like, is there a relation to doing this to garner internal legitimacy through, creating a common enemy of sorts?
No, no, it's totally relevant as a question. And again, I think we shouldn't forget the heritage of Assad policies that deepened, sectarianism, ethnic hatred among the Syrian population. This is something Syrian society is suffering, and that was deepened during the war. And Assad regime played a key role in this. The problem following the fall of the Assad regime, this government did not tackle these issues to create, a new form of inclusive, if you want, political project for all the Syrians. I was explaining before, it really much continued to deepen and fragment, if you want, Syria politically, socially, and unfortunately as well on ethnic and sectarian basis. As I was mentioning before, the fact that, Sweden played quite an important and significant role during the revolution. They were, nearly autonomous from the Syrian Assad regime in the 2 last years. They were very much in solidarity with Palestine, with Gaza. Now it's a complete, total different scene. On the opposite, you see more often, flags of Israel. You see a willingness by certain sectors to, to seek the support of Israel, and this is a direct consequence of the massacres committed against the Jews. Obviously, there are other reasons, by the lack of democratic and progressive forces within Syrian society be able to gather the frustration and to transform it into a progressive kind of to progressive demands, progressive project, etc. And similarly, decentralization, especially during the Syrian Revolution, was becoming more and more popular among Syrian population, regardless of ethnic and sectarian background. A lot of people were asking for decentralization to be able to participate more in the management of their own, city, province, village, to have a wider political participation in the management of local affairs. So, and this government has pushed the idea that it's more a demand connected to religious minorities or the Kurds, accusing them now, in Syria, not only, historically speaking, Kurds were always accused of being separatists. Now we have other separatists sometimes being accused. The Alawites, sometimes the Jews are also called, separatists in this perspective, unfortunately. So again, the propaganda of the new ruling class is very more problematic and actually increasing and deepening the fragmentation in the Syrian society. So this is the first responsibility that has this government. It has deepened the division, fragmentation of the Syrian population. Now, if we look at what happened regarding the, if you want to, especially the northeast, but also regarding what happened in Sheikh Massoud and Ashrafiyeh, Kurdish majority inhabited areas in Aleppo, the dynamics are multiple. First of all, it's definitely a continuation of the willingness of the new ruling class to centralize power in Damascus, not to have any kind of political rival political institutions in the Syrian national scene. So first of all, it should be seen like this. While there've been, in 2025, March 10 agreement between the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces led by Mazloum Abdi and the central government, negotiation had not been able to go forward when it comes to the integration of SDF. Now there's a new agreement hopefully, and I think the most important thing in this agreement was stopping the bloodshed, stopping the threats on Kurdish population. Although I have a lot of questions, I think a lot of questions are still need to be raised on the implementation of this agreement, and especially that while it is important to recognize historical discrimination made against Kurdish population by the new decree by the president regarding providing the same nationality to the Kurds that were deprived of it following the census of 1962 in Hasakeh, providing the ability to speak in their own language and to teach and to learn in their own language is important, as well as symbolically providing, Eid al-Nowruz, are important things and should be, but what about political participation? What about political participation of Kurdish political parties in the centers of decision making? And this is a question that relates to all the Syrian society. So I think the first thing was to see that the latest military offensive is a new attempt or continuous attempt to centralize power in Damascus, to eliminate other political rivals, while at the same time, recognizing national rights that are important, but are still question to be raised in its implementation. And what about political participation? This is still not an answer. And secondly, we cannot deny the fact that this has been done also to satisfy Turkish interest. Turkey was never going to accept any form of self-autonomy of the Kurdish population in Syria, because, as I said before, it sees it as the continuation of a national threat regarding Turkey and its own, ethnic chauvinism when it comes to the Kurdish population. So therefore, it was clear that it was also acting in the interests of Turkey. And this was done, coming back to your previous question, with the green light of the US. This not being possible to this level without the green light given by the US. And therefore, while decentralization is something we should push forward, especially politically, it still needs to be discussed how it can be made. Because when we speak of decentralization, doesn't mean that you have a weak center. On the opposite, I think we can have a strong decentralization, increasing the participation, the political participation from below of the people, while a center that is able to be equal and just with all the sectors of the society, because no one denies, there will be a need, for, a unique foreign policy or the ability to redistribute the wealth of Syria. Because if we look at the northeast, which is the most impoverished areas of Syria, both Arabs and Kurds, actually, it is also the most wealthy in terms of oil, gas, and agriculture. So decentralization is also about redistribution of wealth throughout society. And we see on this file as well, because of its pro-neoliberal policies serving the interest of the 1% in Syria, this government is not going into this direction.
And I mean, what you just said is actually really important, connecting the kind of discussions or the explorations around, autonomy or decentralization, particularly when it comes to, Kurdish communities or Kurdish societies, which has seen like the kind of, I guess, the most heard or the most, the loudest like calls for decentralization. But speaking to certain, Alawites, particularly in the coastal areas, and, Druze in Sweden. Some have also expressed that the kind of continuation of the autonomous regions in the northeast, they almost saw it as a guarantor for themselves, that the future for them also cannot get, even worse than, some of the experiences they've had in the last year or so. How can we understand this in terms of a future vision? Because you also said earlier on that, one of the ways that we can understand that al-Sharaa knows he doesn't have the internal legitimacy that, well, perhaps one he would want, but also that he needs. We can understand that through the kind of the lack of a proper national conference and so on. So how can we understand also the some of the connections now that are developing between the Kurdish people, particularly in the northeast, the Druze and the Alawites, for developing a vision for what the future of Syria could look like?
Yeah, there are different points here. I think, first of all, to come back to your previous question and this one, I think Syria as a society would be stronger if you had an inclusive and democratic political project. As well, it would be more stable, definitely, and less keen to foreign interventions, because definitely various foreign interventions are seeking exploitation of these sectarian ethnic differences for their own interest, as we can see it by Turkey in the north, exploiting, kind of Arab slash Islamic chauvinism, extremism against the Kurds, while Israel is seeking the exploitation, of discrimination against Kurds, what happened in Sweden for their own interest. So a stronger society is built with a project that seek the common good, that seek to be inclusive and democratic from below. And this is one step forward, for diminishing instability within society and also foreign intervention. Secondly, I think also, people, whenever you speak in the Middle East generally, federalism is something people are scared because they see the case of Iraq after 2003, complete separation between Kurdistan, Iraq, and Baghdad. Or during the civil war in Lebanon, it was very often used by, the far right, Christian right wing, Lebanese forces, to find a form of isolation. So federalism, people are scared. Decentralization, there's more space to speak, but regardless of the term you use, there's a need of a political discussion about what we mean about decentralization. When it comes to, and again, I think also people, I use this example, but Syria is very much different. For example, in Syria, until 2011, half of the Kurds were not in the northeast. They were between Damascus and Aleppo. So even the accusation of separatism doesn't make sense. You can see this political accusation to seek, forms of political mobilization, discriminations, etc. So decentralization here obviously has a particular, history when it comes to the Kurdish question in Syria, because not only with the Baas, but prior to this, there was a historical structural discrimination of Kurdish population that started with the unity of Syria and Egypt, with the United Arab Republic, where you had a strong repression against Kurdish political parties, the ability even to speak Kurdish. You had also actions committed against the Kurds prior to this. You had development of a discourse that were saying basically among some Arab nationalist tendency in Syria saying, characterizing the Kurds as Zionists, to say that they're external to the social fabric in Syria, that they came from outside, which is very much dangerous. While at the same time, Arab nationalists developed a colonization project in the north against Kurds, very similar to actually Zionist dynamics on the way, you had the Arab Belt, which was a project to colonize through Arab population, Kurdish areas to prevent the name of Kurdish villages into Arabic, etc. So the inability to speak their languages, etc. So decentralization here has a special meaning that makes sense, and moreover, it should be into a national project, basically, and which is part of the discussion today with the new decree of the Syrian presidency. How much will Kurdish national language be recognized as an official national language within Syria? Is still not very clear, because it says basically Kurdish could be taught in majority inhabited Kurdish areas. So is it only the northeast, or are we talking about as well, for example, Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo and Damascus? What about these areas? Which language? This needs to be discussed. And when we speak about decentralization, shouldn't be on an ethnic or sectarian basis. Because what we're saying, decentralization, again, is not a demand only of the religious minorities or Kurds. It's a general demand, just as democracy against sectarianism, for security is demand that concern all the Syrians, regardless of their ethnic and sectarian background. So when it comes to the Sweda, majority inhabited Jews population at around 90%, following the fall of the regime, because they had been living to some extent a form of autonomy from the Assad regime, they had this experience, local organization, etc. They said, we're ready to self-organize, but with, have a form of autonomy, but with collaboration with the same presidency. So they presented a person as a governor, a woman from the province. They refused Damascus and imposed a governor from outside the province. And every time they were trying to prevent, forms of local autonomy for Sweden, which reached the point of July and the massacres, attempts forcefully by arms to take over the region. These demands still go on regarding Sweden from former local autonomy, but it changed massively after the massacres. They're really much an isolation of Sweden society, unfortunately, pushed by sectors of Sweden that we knew from before that wanted to collaborate with Israel, including Khajari, who is acting in a very authoritarian way. And I think we have to be clear, we can be supportive of the demands of Sweden for security, for local autonomy, etc., while opposing this leadership, which is problematic in many ways, and repressing some voices that want an independent path and towards Syria, but opposed to the government. When it comes to the coastal areas, first of all, it's not homogeneous areas. It's not Alawite areas, if you see what I mean. It's very homogeneous, very diverse, with Sunni communities, with Christian communities, Alawites. So decentralization here also needs to be taken on a political administrative way rather than sectarian. But the ability, again, I think the key issue is the ability for people to participate in a national project, to participate in the management of local affairs, and basically to participate in the, daily political transition of Syria. This is the key demand. And I think these demands have even taken a more important weight among minorities because of the policies of the government. You see, these demands have come much more to the rise among Kurds, for historical reasons, as we say, it's nothing new, but Jews, Alawites, much more. But again, I think we shouldn't only limit these demands as demands from religious minorities. It's demands that is much wider in society, but the problem that these demands are characterized as religious and sectarian background. No, it's about participating in the future of Syria from below insecurity.
And perhaps, another way to also really understand it, as you've also briefly touched on, is, a democratic society or democratic societies are harder to exploit, both by perhaps possible problematic leaderships, and also from external factors. Like, it's also understood that particularly forces that, have also imperialist, aims and also interests, particularly in the Middle East region, of course, also prefer quite a centralized form in which society is forced to live. And also, I think it's also probably important to understand that there are many, many decentralized models in the world. Not that, of course, many of them have flaws, but also there is an opportunity for Syria to even develop its own one that can be a model for others. I want to ask you, connected to that, as a final question, we've also seen the way that one of the main ways that, Qatar has been trying to push its interest when it comes to Syria is through its media outlets, particularly through its state media, Al Jazeera, which many people came to trust because of its coverage of, what was happening in Palestine, the genocide in Gaza. And there's been, recent claims that, for example, I mean, we don't need to go into all the details right now, but for example, that the threat of ISIS was exaggerated to begin with, and so on. So I wonder if there is a connection where, there may be critiques of it, and I think that that would be the process of course, a democratic process of really, engagement, right? But undoubtedly, I think most people will will accept that the regions in the northeast, where the autonomous administration of the northeast of Syria have been governing, the kind of particularly the status of women, so women's liberation and a form of radical democracy, have been quite central to organizing principles, whether there may be critiques in some of the ways that they were implemented or not. So I wonder what you think about, could there be, like, beyond territorial control, something about the alternative model in these areas that threatens the kind of Syria that particularly al-Sharaa and those who are supporting him want to build? And because a lot of people kind of, it really clicked, I think, for a lot of people when one of the first things that Shara's forces did when they went into some of the areas that had been cleansed of ISIS by the SDF, that they destroyed female fighter statues and so on. So could there be that beyond territorial control and beyond the kind of veneer and the narrative of this sectarianism, it is just a vision that they just don't want for Syria?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Elif. I think there's also a few levels. First of all, as you were saying, there are different experiences of decentralization throughout the world that should be studied. And regardless also of this, what is the record of strong authoritarian states in the region? If we look at Syria, Iraq, being very much Arab chauvinistic, dividing society by their policies and committing crimes. If we look at the Iraqi, crimes against the Kurds when it comes to Anfa, but when we see the repression in the south as well, or other sectors of society, Syria, also a strong central state, has been very much repressive. So, do we want to follow this kind of path? What I think is the objective of the new authoritarian ruling class is problematic. So, first of all, say what is the record of what we've seen already? It's quite very bad, quite negative, etc. Secondly, when it comes to Jazeera, I've always been careful of Jazeera because it follows a particular, sets when it comes to foreign policies. If you want, the English edition is a bit more open-minded, but the Arabic way followed quite, to some extent, the foreign policy of Qatar. And what we witnessed since the fall of the Assad regime is that at different moments in time, when it comes to the massacres of Alawites in March, massacres of Jews in July, or the latest, offensive, military armed offensive from the government against Kurdish areas, Qatar has basically followed the propaganda of the Syrian government, portraying, sometimes the opponents as separatists or ancien regime supporters, etc. So, and using quite also sectarian, propaganda quite clearly. So it has played a very negative role when it comes, especially to media understanding or understanding of the population regarding Syria. Quite really much following the propaganda of the Syrian government, portraying issues in a sectarian ways. And this has been the case even during the revolution, rather than trying to bring forward a more inclusive understanding of the events, of political evolutions. The sectarian issue was very much put forward in a negative way by Al Jazeera. So obviously we can salute its role when it comes to the Palestinian issue to bring forward a lot of things compared to European medias that have been definitely catastrophic and played a negative role in boosting a certain Israeli propaganda. It shouldn't also undermine our understanding of what is Al Jazeera, what it is serving as a political project regarding Qatari foreign interest, etc. So let's be clear also on this role. Now, when it comes to the autonomous administration of the northeast of Syria, obviously it needs a discussion. But first of all, I think it's important for me to reiterate, whether here or elsewhere, as I did it in the past, my complete support for the self-determination of the Kurdish people, whether in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran. It's a population that suffered, systematic oppression in these different countries with ethnic chauvinism, etc. And therefore, the ability to self govern particular areas with Kurdish majority, something I see as positive. Autonomous administration, as you were mentioning, had a policy to promote the participation of women in society, in institution, and women's rights. And this was something also very much present among other Kurdish political parties even prior to 2011. And I think this is something positive. Also regarding promotion to some extent of more secularization of laws, etc. This said, and I think we can't understand the way the self-administration of the northeast Syria lost territories with an Arab majority, especially Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, because of the lack basically of participation from Arab population into the institutions of ANS, really. I mean, in effective ways. And this was actually, you know, a criticism made by some activists I knew from Raqqa or Deir ez-Zor, said actually we wish that the self-administration would implement what it says, you know, power from below, municipal, to have a, you know, a further participation in these local affairs, which was not the case, to say it bluntly. And this is why it also fell quite fast in the Arab majority population. Also, you had, you know, security campaigns targeting young men, activists being arrested. So there were problems also when it came to some forms of repression that not only Arabs suffered, also, you know, Kurdish political parties rival to the self-administration. And therefore, I think also we have to point out to this limitation to seek for something better, a real, you know, participation from below, from everywhere. So therefore, here I think we need a bit of nuance when it comes to you know, this kind of policies. Also, when it comes to socio-economic policies, but also it was a war-torn situation. It did not radically change, you know, policies. It was mostly dependent on oil rent, trade. Things could have been, I think, done in some better ways. But again, it's not to deny some positive issues that we should recognize. And it was definitely, and yes, even though it was sometimes symbolically inclusive, but it was definitely more inclusive than what you had in Idlib or the Turkish occupation areas in many ways, while it has its own limitations. And finally, seeking more coalition with, you know, Arab leadership tribes would change leadership loyalty 10 times rather than seeking consentment and coalition with, I would say, popular classes of especially in Arab majority inhabited areas. So this said, definitely Hayat Tahrir al-Sham dominating ruling authority does not see in a good way, you know, promotion of women's rights, participation. In the current government, we have only one woman minister. In the current so-called parliament, what has been appointed is less than 5% of women, but more generally, we have attacks on women's rights, you know, the local initiatives by groups supportive or affiliated with Damascus to wear the niqab. Obviously, it's a right to wear the niqab, but you have, you know, support also by these kind of state institutions, a particular conservative atmosphere. Just lately speaking, the governorate of Latakia forbid women to wear maquillage, as this is a key priority today in Syria. If local state employees can wear maquillage or not, they've been, you know, statements made by HTS officials or lately by the Mufti of the Republic, Rifai, that Sharia is over any kind of laws, and the future battles regarding constitutions, etc. We have to be careful that this is maintained. So they definitely, you know, the current government promote a more conservative, more patriarchal way of seeing society. Not meaning that the previous regime wasn't patriarchal conservative, it was, but it's even deepening as a way to control more society through these patriarchal codes, conservative codes. So there is definitely something here, but again, I think the key issue is about this latest military offensive is to eliminate any kind of political rival, centralization of power in an authoritarian way, and not through dialogue. A lot of Syrian people are saying, listen, the Syrian government is able to talk with an enemy like Israel, considered by large sectors of sectarian society as an enemy, still occupying, Syrian land, still doing a genocide in Palestine, and this government is not even able to talk with Syrian society, regardless of being the Kurds, the Jews, the Alawite, but the Syrian society in general. They're not even able to open dialogue, a true dialogue for a true democratic representation and participation from below. So this is really a challenge for Syria's future. And again, I think the Kurdish national question in Syria is connected to a wider democratization of Syria, and the democratization of Syria is connected to putting forward the Kurdish national question. I think it is completely connected, and we shouldn't see it in a contradictory way or separately. No, it is completely connected.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for your time and for your thoughts. I'm sure we'll have many, many more conversations, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.